So, this is the reason why I think this term enumeration became popular, because of this very strange thing Microsoft did, and I've never heard anybody explain what the point of this was. But I'll show it to you. There's a thing called a null session, which is where you log in with an empty username and an empty password. And somebody at Microsoft decided that this will give you privileges to see information that you weren't allowed to see before you logged in this way. I don't know what anybody was thinking when they did this, but that's the point. This thing is called a null session. It was around until about Windows XP, so it's finally pretty much disabled in the modern versions of Windows. But this is what led, I think, to this concept of enumeration, where even before you have any valid username and password, you can get a lot of information. You can get a list of the users and groups, shares. You can get the security identifiers for the accounts, which is the number that specifies exactly which accounts there are. Yeah.
So this was advertised to.
It was on the network, advertised to the network, but only if you logged in with the null username and null password.
Okay.
So somebody had this idea somehow that making someone log in with an empty username and password somehow proved that they were worthy more than someone who hadn't logged in this fashion. And that's the part that boggles my mind. Anyway, but that's the way it worked. So I'm not going to do it. I don't have Windows 2000 Pro around anymore, but you could share a folder. And then if you go to the command prompt and connect, it won't connect because you haven't authorized. You have to authorize yourself with an empty password and empty username here. This quote, this is the password here, and this is the username. And now you can connect, because now you've proven you're authorized by having an empty name and password. It's called a null session. And once you have connected, once you've logged in this fashion, not only can you open shared folders, but you can get a lot of information. For example, if you have followed Microsoft security practices and renamed the administrator account to another name, the null session will just tell you which one is the administrator. It'll tell you how often people have to change their password. It'll tell you how long you get locked out by making too many password guesses. Now, there is no reason for anybody to know that except the system administrator. It's just to help you break in. Lots of information that is totally none of your business is here. It tells you who's logged in and whether they're the administrator. Just a bunch of stuff that is none of your bloody business. And I don't know what they were thinking when they did that. But anyway, it's been around for a long time. It was an essential part of Windows networking. And Microsoft gradually got over it as they moved into these more secure products like XP and Vista and Windows 7. Windows XP and Server 2003 supposedly have them. I could never make them work. Anyway, and now there's no longer any supported version of Windows that has this, except perhaps Windows XP embedded. So you can enumerate NetBIOS, which is still used, with any tool that can just send out the right commands. There's an NBT stat command included with Microsoft. You can use NetView. NetView will show you all the resources that are available to connect to, and NetUse will connect to them to open that folder. This is how you connect to a shared folder from the command line. All right. And there are Linux tools that will enumerate NetBIOS networks. If you put a Linux machine on a Microsoft network, there's a SMB4K tool, which was in Backtrack, the predecessor to Corley, and I imagine it's still in Corley. And then, of course, any vulnerability scanner, like Nessus, will do this. So the SMB4K tool will find the locally shared objects in the NetBIOS network, and DumpSec will dump out everything that it can get permissions for, even things like the registry. Again, things that are really none of your business. Hyena is another product that will scan Windows networks and detect a lot of services they're offering, and looks like that. It's got a pretty graphical interface. And Nessus, of course, and OpenVAS. Nessus is the commercial product, the standard open source vulnerability scanner, and OpenVAS is the 100% free open source imitation of it. And both of them work similarly. They just go down a long list of scans, and they will do ping scans, port scans, SMB enumeration, and then go down a list of vulnerabilities, testing them to see if it's vulnerable to this and that. So Nessus, the old version of Nessus looked like that, and you'd scan something, and then you'd get a list of devices it found, and it will then find vulnerabilities. Here's one that shows that this machine replies to NetBIOS NBT scan requests. So it is a thing you should know that it is announcing its availability over NetBIOS. And here's another one that says you can access a network share, so without a password, that's an issue. Anyway, you guys can also enumerate what service pack you're using, and so on. So I got a few iClickers about this, and then we'll say a little bit about Unix enumeration, which is much less of an issue than Windows enumeration. This whole concept of enumeration came from the fact that Windows machines will tell you a ton of information before you actually have a valid username and password, which is kind of screwy, but they will. Anyway, oops. All right, now it's listening. All right, so what item do you get from a null session back in old Windows 2000? All right, I'll quit at 30. All right, you get the administrator account name. You don't get the password. You don't get these other things either. But you get the account name, which is none of your business, but it's not as bad as just giving you the password. That would be too crazy even for Microsoft. All right, which one of these do you not get from a null session? Quit at 30. All right, and you get all that stuff except you don't get the exact length of the password. You get the requirements, like how long it has to be, but it doesn't tell you the specific length of one password. It'll tell you, though, that it must be more than 8 letters or something. All right. And what's the command line utility to connect to a shared folder? You probably noticed all the projects involve command line, typically Unix, but sometimes Windows. You very often have to use the command line when hacking. You don't have the opportunity to graphical interface and use the mouse, so you have to get pretty good at using command lines. All right, and that is NetUse, to use a shared folder. NetShare is how you offer shared folders to others, but it's NetUse to use a folder that somebody else shared. All right. What's that?
NetUse?
NetUse, yeah. NetShare is what the person did at the other end to make the folder available to you. All right, and then a few things about Unix and Linux. Oh, NetWare first. There's this crazy operating system. See, there are like 100 operating systems in the world, but if I was running a company and they wanted to make a new operating system, I would just fire those people. I mean, whatever you're doing, you can do it with either Windows or Linux. There's 100 different kinds of Linux, and if you join a club, like the community supporting Linux, like Ubuntu Linux, then all these people are out there writing patches and device drivers and security patches. Why would you want to have your own OS where you have to do all that? It's a huge expenditure. This is why the Cisco team got so frustrated. They have this junk called iOS, the Internet Network Operating System, that is not Linux and not DOS. They wrote their own OS and they refused to upgrade, and there's no reason at all. Juniper, some Cisco engineers finally got so irritated they formed their own company called Juniper, and it just runs OpenBSD Unix, and it is so much easier to use and so much nicer because you just use good old Unix commands instead of having to learn this goofy language that Cisco wrote decades ago. So anyway, but there are ones out there. Novell was one of these. Novell wrote their own operating system, and they did it for a good reason. Back in the early 90s and the late 80s, in fact, I think around 89 or so, Novell actually had like 90% of the server market because there was nothing else except Unix, which was hard to use. There was nothing that actually would share folders with a Windows file system very well. So they, just for simple things like file servers, people would get Novell NetWare. It was the server operating system that would offer shared files to a lot of machines, but they never wrote a client version, so they had a fundamental business problem. You would run NetWare on the server, and you'd have to run Windows on the workstations, and you'd all say, why do we have to learn two different OSs, one for the server and one for the workstation? And when Microsoft finally came out with Windows servers, that was pretty much the death knell for them, because everybody had to use Windows anyway. And so they wrote this thing, and it was around for a long time, had various versions. Originally, I think it was 3.1 was the one that came on a stack of 14 floppies. I remember installing that thing and fixing it. It had this MS-DOS looking interface. And you paid for it. You paid thousands of bucks, and you got like a 25 user license. And my shop, like many, had about 35 employees. So they would fill up the list. And one of my jobs, one of my early server administrator jobs, was to be the guy to go in there and delete the unused connections several times a day, because people would come in and other people would leave, and you'd have to delete their connections so new people could get on. So it was pretty painful, but that was the way it was. And then they updated the thing to 5.0 and 5.1. And around NetWare 6, even Novell figured out that this was for the birds, and they switched to Linux. So NetWare 5.1 is still used. By the way, these things were solid, like Cisco routers. You could put up a NetWare server, and that thing would just run for years without crashing. So people are still using them. People are still installing new OSs with this old stuff because it's working, and they don't want to change it. And the people that do this most are like banks. Banks are incredibly conservative. There are banks still using Token Ring, because once banks won't even touch anything until it's been in use for like 10 years, because it's like experimental and unreliable. And once they get it, they will just keep using it forever, because they don't care how much it costs, they don't care whether it's fast, they just want it to be reliable. And they don't trust anything until everyone else has got all the kinks out of it. So they have no problem using really old stuff for a really long time. Anyway, so Nessus, if you enumerate a NetWare server, you'll find the same kind of thing you might on a Windows server, a domain controller. It's listening on a bunch of ports. It's got a bunch of file shares and so on. It'll have vulnerabilities just like everything else. Here's this Nessus finding out that you can log into the FTP share with an admin and password. So I guess it tries common passwords to detect that. And this, one thing about NetWare that it had, let me blow this up because it's too small to see here. It had this crazy thing. See, NetWare is so old that it predates TCP/IP. So they had, and the domain name system. See, they had their own system called IPX-SPX, which replaces TCP and IP with their own networking protocol, and they had their own domain system to try to make a hierarchical change. So instead of having .com and yahoo.com and ns1.yahoo.com, they had a thing called a tree and a forest and a server to have different levels of hierarchy. So when you join a NetWare, you connect to a NetWare server, you do it in this strange ancient thing which was a competitor against DNS, which lost, but NetWare is still using it. So you had to put the Novell client for Windows. I remember this drove me nuts. Every day you come in, you have to log in twice. First you log in with your Windows password to get the desktop. Then you have to log in to the Novell server with a separate login process, and typically a separate password. And this uses this crazy stuff of tree, context, and server. So Zion Bank, Context New York, Server Bank, instead of having server2.microsoft.com, which was the DNS way to do it. So anyway, you're not used to seeing this thing logging in every day, and once you logged in, it would then map the Z drive to map to the shared folder on the NetWare server, and off you go. As you log in, you see results like this here. Your current context is New York. Your admin context, your tree is here. You're attached to this server, and now we're going to map a Z drive, which goes to the public share. And that was why you did it, because all the shared folders for your business were on the NetWare server. All right. Anyway, people are still using them. You'll see it here. You connect to the Z drive and you see all your shared folders. I remember doing this stuff for years. All right, that's the joy of NetWare. NetWare did, in version 6, they finally switched to Linux. It's called a thing called SLED, SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop, based on SUSE. It was a huge flop. I actually tried to take certification classes and get certified in it to teach it here, because I thought this is what's finally going to kill Windows. They finally got a Linux client and a Linux server coming from Novell, but nobody cared. They couldn't find 4 people in the whole state of California that would pay $1,000, and I was to go to a class to teach this stuff, to learn this stuff. And I said, well, I guess there's no point teaching it to students. I'm the only one excited about this product on earth, so we'll just forget it. And it never went anywhere, because Novell had apparently irritated their customers so much that people were happy to put up with like Windows 2000 servers instead. And that's what happened. So there's also Unix. Unix and Linux are so important. You know, we're using it heavily in this class. You got to know Unix. It is the right answer for many things. The reason Windows exists, in my opinion, is because of domain controllers. If you are a huge company with 10,000 computers in 100 locations, and you want to buy another huge company and integrate the two networks together, this is a monstrous job, and Linux has got nothing for you. Microsoft is the only company playing in that space. They have these domain controllers, and they have all these complicated security features and performance features, so you can absorb a whole domain into yours and configure cross-forest trusts and everything else so that the development team of the new company can log into their servers, and they can also log into some servers here, but not these servers there. You can manage a gigantic corporation, and Windows is the only tool left there. The only other person that ever tried to play in this game was Novell, and they're effectively dead and gone. So anyway, Unix is useful, but not for that kind of thing, not controlling 10,000 machines typically, for high-performance servers. If you got servers and they got like Cloudflare, they got these server farms all over the place that are handling 10% of the entire internet, making copies of pages, filtering out the DDoS attacks and everything else, and they want that stuff to go fast, so it's all Linux. Anyway, so there are many, many versions. Some of them are free, some you have to pay money for. But you know, the Mac is Linux. It's Unix now, running on BSD Unix, a modification called Darwin. And we're using Corley in the lab, which is the processualized pen tester version based on Debian. Ubuntu is the most popular at home users in America, but businesses mostly use Red Hat. Red Hat has a free version called Fedora that you can practice on, and it has an enterprise version that you pay for, and then you get support, and they're actually making money that way. They have a business making a lot of money. Businesses are using it, and they're paying Red Hat for support. And if you go get a Red Hat certified engineer, which it's a very good credential to get, so my students have got it, this is a right cert test. It's not a multiple choice test. The Red Hat certified engineer test, they stick you in a room with no access to the internet and no books, and they put this computer on your desk, and it's broken. You won't even boot up. They say, okay, we're coming back in 8 hours, and by then, this thing ought to be an email server, FTP server, a web server. First, you have to fix it so it'll boot up, then you have to recover the password, then you have to install all that stuff and make it work, and we'll see it. If it all works, you pass. If it doesn't work, you don't pass. And that's a good test, you know. You hire that person, they're not going to be an idiot when you put them in your server room. Yeah?
How can you test your solution with no internet?
They come in, maybe they connect it to test it. Yeah. And I think it has a local area network. But you can't go to Google or anything. You got to figure it all. You got to know how to do it all. So, you know, that's such a good test. Anyway, I don't have it, but some of my students have it. But that's a good cert test to get. This is one of the reasons why we have this department. This is one argument I had over in the CS department that made everyone hate me, is I said, we should teach Red Hat certification. And they said, be gone, you doer of evil, and kicked us out. So anyway, so we left and formed another department. Anyway, so finger is what you do to see who's on the system, because chat and profiles and social networking were all first in Unix. Before the internet, you'd have the people using one Unix server, like you're in the same company, and they would make profile and email and chat and everything. So you figure, well, you see their profile, you'd see who's on there, and if you type finger, it'll just show you who's connected right now. And you type finger one person, it'll show you their profile, which had a little joke and tells you whether they've read their email lately and such. So Nessus can enumerate these things. It will enumerate the services available and the shares and such. So you see the usual stuff, what ports are open here, and then you see security issues here. It's possible to obtain some information about the remote host because it's speaking Bonjour, which is an Apple-oriented protocol of DNS, sort of like a Windows file share, and so on. You can use any commercial phone scanner to enumerate Linux or any of the operating systems. All right, so this is the last batch of iClickers. Here's my doodad. All right, so which one of these will you not find when you scan a NetWare server? I'll quit at 30. All right, you will not find Active Directory because that's a Microsoft product. It is, however, an imitation of the NetWare product, eDirectory. NetWare was the first server with central point of administration, and Microsoft wanted to put it in Windows domain controllers, so they tried to buy the NetWare company. And NetWare refused to sell the company, so they bought the developer. They hired the developer, gave him a raise to rewrite it over here and call it Active Directory, and that's what they got. Anyway.
It's a cheaper acquisition.
Yeah, well, that's what you do. You can acquire the company, so you acquire the developer. And he rewrites it over here, and that's the one that won. The original product never took off because NetWare followed it up. And that's why a lot of people say the success of Silicon Valley is because we don't have non-compete agreements in California. Other companies, when you get a job, they will make you sign. Not everybody has non-disclosure agreements. You agree not to hand over the secrets. But you'll also sign a non-complete agreement, which means you're like developing networking technology at our company, and if you leave, you can't work in networking technology for 5 years, which is like slavery. I mean, what are you going to do? It's your specialty, and you can't leave. I don't know how that's legal at all. I'm glad they don't do that out here. That's pretty awful. But it does mean that if you don't treat your employees right, they will just leave and form a startup and steal your lunch. So.
It also doesn't stop companies from trying.
Oh, they do. And there's this huge lawsuit where they found out that Apple and Google and everybody were conspiring to keep the wages low so they wouldn't bid against each other's employees, which defeats the whole point of competition. That's the kind of stuff antitrust laws are for. Yeah, they got a big fine for that. Anyway, so which of these is not Unix? All right, quit at 30. There are 150 versions of Linux last time I looked at the website enumerating them all. But there's like 6 main branches. But a lot of people just write their own just to learn how. Anyway, so that is NetWare. NetWare was actually not Linux. They had their own OS. Then they switched to SLED, SUSE Linux Enterprise Desktop. But that early NetWare was not DOS, not Windows, not Linux. It was their own strange contraption. All right. All right. Which of these cannot enumerate Linux or Unix? All right, I'm quitting at 30. All right, and that are null sessions. Null sessions are a monstrosity that Microsoft thought up and nobody else ever did, and you don't have those on Linux. They have security problems, but not that one. All right. And somewhere I've got the grader. Oh, I might as well stop the recording because the grading's not that exciting. This is 123, Chapter 6B.